Hi everyone, and welcome to the Policy Pub, a series of videos where we will explore some of the capabilities of the Broadcom Layer 7 API Gateway. My name is Jay McDonald, and I'm an adoption architect with the Broadcom Layer 7 API management team. Today I'm going to continue with our discussion of client certificate authentication and federated identity providers, but in this case we're going to introduce the notion of a non-CA based FIP. So first, a bit of an overview. I hope that you've had a chance to watch the previous episodes of the Policy Pub. In particular, the last one, Working with Federated Identity Providers Part 1, wherein we introduced the idea of a federated identity provider that is based on a signing authority. Now, federated identity providers can also be used for explicit certificate authentication, so not just federated authentication. This is actually the most common use of FIPs that I've seen. Now you may recall if you've watched Policy Pub number 1 where we discussed explicit certificate authentication, we worked with an identity provider, the internal identity provider, where we loaded the certificate into that. And you can also have an identity provider in the form of an LDAP with certificates in it. The problem with those is that they can be a little bit cumbersome to deal with, and in particular, you have to create an identity with a password. So when you're working with a partner, they may provide you with a self-signed certificate, and you implicitly trust that certificate because, well, they provided it to you. So the simplest way to work with that certificate is probably to use a FIP rather than the internal identity provider. So in this presentation, we're going to cover using non-CA based federated identity providers. Now here's the flow. On the left we have a client, and in my example I'm going to use a fictitious company, a fictitious partner that we'll call Acme Products. And they may be providing rockets for your roller skates or something like that. Anyway, this will be represented by Key Tool, OpenSSL, and curl again. And on the right we have our gateway. Now the first step is to create the FIP and an identity in it. So we create a non-CA FIP that has no signing authority associated with it. Then we create an identity inside of that FIP and import the certificate for that identity into the FIP. Then at runtime, as usual, we send the request with the certificate and we validate that certificate against the federated identity provider. Of course, there's caveats. This is basically an explicit certificate flow without involving an identity provider. So it comes with all the same caveats that we explored in the first episode of the Policy Pub, which is things like provisioning certificates. Everybody has to be involved in it. When a certificate expires, you have to reload it into the federated identity provider. And there's no notion of revocation checking on it. In addition, if you are working on a gateway that has both a CA-based federated identity provider and a non-CA based identity provider, for every certificate you load into the non-CA FIP, you have to also import that certificate into the trust store and mark it as valid for signing client certificates. This has to do with the TLS protocol, with the TLS handshake protocol, that when the gateway has certificates that are marked for signing client certificates, it will send those in the certificate request message of the handshake at connection time so that the client will have to send certificates that are on that list that have been signed by a CA. By default, the gateway does not send that list until a certificate has been marked as valid for signing client certificates. So most of the time we don't worry about that. But if you have both of these, then you're going to run into problems. And we'll see that in action during the demonstration. So speaking of, let's go to our demonstration. This is how things were left when we finished off the previous Policy Pub. We were authenticating against the virtual group of Vancouver users. Now, in this screen, we have the client represented by the command line, and over here a script that I'm going to use. Now I have this user called Acme, And it is a self-signed certificate. Okay, so we can see that it's, the CN is partner app, and it's the organization is Acme Products based out of New York, but it is a self-signed certificate. Now, under the previous setup or the existing setup, this is going to fail if I use this certificate. Now, I know I've not set anything up in there to use this, but what I'm illustrating here is it comes back with authentication required. Now, what that means to me is that the client didn't even send the certificate. And that is because right now the gateway is configured with a certificate for signing client certificates, and that is advertised as part of the handshake, and we don't have one of those kinds of certificates. So the first thing I'm going to do is to disable the client certificates for the arbitrary CA. Go into Manage Certificates, select this, go to Options, and turn off Signing Client Certificates. Okay, I'm going to pause the recording because it takes a little while for this to get picked up by the gateway. Okay, it's a couple of minutes later and the gateway has picked it up. I can tell because it is now erroring out with authentication failed. Okay, so now we're going to go in and create a non-CA based federated identity provider in the gateway. So we'll right mouse click here, create federated identity provider, demo non-CA FIP. We'll go to next. We're not going to map it to a certificate here, and it's going to warn us about a few things. We can no longer use virtual groups, and every identity that you wish to authorize using X509 credentials will need to have their certificate imported manually. Okay, well that's our objective here. And I'll click on Finish. Next, I'm going to add a user for this Acme Products self-signed certificate into this non-CA federated identity provider. Okay. I'll make it a little more clear in the username. And we'll load in the certificate from here. Okay, this looks right. We'll click on Finish. Not going to worry about this warning, it's just case mismatch. All right. Now, we're going to change the policy to authenticate against that demo non-CA FIP. We'll remove this assertion. We'll go into our access control and say demo non-CA FIP. Okay, good. So now when I make the call with that self-signed Acme certificate, everybody should work. Now note I've added another line to my response to tell us who the issuer DN was. But if I try calling this with the JMAC cert, it will fail with authentication failed. So this is how we can do explicit certificate authentication using a federated identity provider. So I've talked a little bit about having both a non-CA FIP and a CA-based FIP can be in conflict with each other. So what if you have a configuration that requires both types of FIPs? Okay, so to start with, we're going to re-enable signing client certificates for the arbitrary CA. Manage certificates, select this, go to options, signing client certificates. Now I'm going to set the policy so that it will authenticate either to the demo CA FIP or the demo non-CA FIP. We'll put in at least one folder, authenticate against the demo non-CA FIP or against the demo CA FIP. So now this policy should be fine eventually against either of these federated identity providers. All right. So we're going to call with the Acme key. And note, we are back at the authentication required here. So this has picked up the change about the signing client certificate, and we're no longer advertising it as valid. So the client didn't even send the certificate. If I try calling with the JMAC key, which is signed by the authority that is advertised, then no problem, it works. So next I'm going to go into my managed certificates and import the Acme self-signed key. Of course, that has the issuer in it, and mark it as valid for signing client certificates. Go into Tasks, Certificates, Keys and Secrets, Manage Certificates, and we'll click on Add. We'll go to here, take our Acme certificate, click on Next. That looks right. We'll set this for signing client certificates and make sure that it is set as a trust anchor. Click on Finish and go to Close. Okay, so now that that certificate is there, I should be able to call with the Acme cert, and it will be properly advertised. And okay, it's been a couple of minutes. Let's give it a try now. And when I make the call, indeed it picks it up. So in summary, using federated identity providers without assigning authority is probably the simplest way to do explicit certificate authentication in the API gateway. Non-CA FIPs do add complexity to the management of an API gateway if a CA FIP is also deployed. So it's something to definitely consider if you're planning to go down this path. And that concludes this episode of the Policy Pub. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics, please visit the Broadcom Layer7 API Management community at the URL that's shown on the screen. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time at the Policy Pub. Cheers.